Greetings, comrades, and welcome back to another episode of the Comrade Cast. And I'm back after our last episode was unfortunately removed by YouTube for misinformation. I guess they thought I was literally saying like World War III was around the corner, rather than being quite worried that we are just about there. Also, obviously, thankfully, the ladder of escalation has not reached up to that next rung, and I am feeling a little bit better than I was in the last episode. I feel like we've more hit the pause button on our escalatory journey rather than our actively de-escalating from where we are now. That being said, I feel like maybe I should stay away from the Middle East and talking about the Middle East for a little bit. But fortunately, it isn't all doom and gloom for the Comrade Cast right now, because one thing I am thankful to finally announce to everybody is that my son is officially entering daycare, which is fantastic for everybody involved, really. Daycare is probably one of the best investments that I ever made for my daughter, putting her in daycare early, because I've really seen her socialization blossom as a result. And of course, it has the added benefit of finally, it feels like my wife and I will get our lives back, and our entire lives may no longer revolve completely around catering to our infant son's every whim. Anyway, it's a huge step forward. It's something I'm pretty excited about because, again, it's just going to open up so much free time, and I'm really hoping this will end a lot of the content drought, a lot of the skipped episodes. All that kind of crap is definitely going to get a lot better moving to the future. I remember the moment I decided to pull the trigger and come back to YouTube was when my daughter was first going into daycare, because I finally had the time to be able to actually devote to making videos again. And I knew just so long as I could keep things scraping and shambling forward until this point, I would be okay. Got some good news and bad news to start off the episode, and without further ado, let's get into it. And so today we are going to focus our energies once again on Eastern Europe and the Russo-Ukraine war, as it's pretty much gotten to the point where everyone is very much so in agreement that the war is in, the momentum right now is with Russia, and there are serious concerns about how this momentum can be blunted. So I want to spend some time talking about where we are now, how we got to the position of where we are, and things that can be done to help Ukraine in the future. So let us once again start our discussion by focusing in on our deep state map here. We're going to look at our area here where the Russians have had the most amount of breakthrough. This is still, again, we're focusing in on the Donbass region. This is still just in the outskirts of Andriivka, which was a couple months ago, you guys may recall. This was a major settlement to have fallen to the Russians, and since then, and they have made some forward progress. But one of the things we always like to stress is that this is not like some spectacular breakthrough where the Ukrainian forces are completely on the run or anything like that. The thing about this war, and obviously we've been following it for years now, is that since the initial kind of thrusts in the war and the initial kind of offensives, things have by and large degraded into this kind of stalemate, and movement is happening very slowly, if at all. In those kind of conditions, it certainly makes the small amount of movement that is happening certainly more impactful. It's going to get more attention. It's going to draw everybody's focus just by definition, just by how this war has played out. So since we last kind of looked at this area and we last looked at this map, the Russians looked like they were on track to get a lot of the area in which they have now. One of the things I really focused in on mentioned was these kind of river basins right here, along here, and up here, to help make makeshift defensive positions for the Ukrainians as they were being pushed back. And those have by and large held. The major point of concern for me right here is this central village. So the main area that I want to draw your attention here is this central village here of Ochiretny, which is like the central basin and the central anchor that anchors a lot of those aforementioned defensive terrain positions and riverbanks. Unfortunately, it looks since we last talked about this, the Russians have very much so broken through Ochiretny and are now really in, I think, a pretty good position here, because as we can see that it's just more fields, it's more open grass, it's more open territory. The next places where Ukraine really has to defend would be along here. We can see more rivers, couple more sections that actually offer some cover, but it's not great. And as you can see, once that key position falls, it leaves this entire section right here now open to be taken, which then of course continues to reinforce that Russian advantage, continues to reinforce that Russian position. And it's the reason why a lot of people are starting to get worried with the amount of momentum the Russian army is showing right now, particularly here in the Donbass. It's not looking great. It's not looking great, unfortunately, and I am worried about what this position can deteriorate into. I just took away the counters for a second so I could actually read the map, just to kind of show you guys where the Russian positions are and where they're advancing to. Who is here? What is the unit that's here? Will it tell me? Okay, the 35th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, along with the 30th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade are both there. Anyway, let's move south for a second, because there is a little bit of movement here in the south, but nothing crazy yet. The Russians have been stalled. There was some movement here, and that I should specify here. This is like the southern Donbass section, not South Ukraine, not the southern part of Ukraine. Early in the year, it looked like the Russians had more momentum in this sector, but things seem to have slowed down quite a bit here. So months ago, the Russians took this little village here of Popieda, and what is that? I think that's Novohorivka. Yeah, it's Novohorivka. And then over here we have Konstantinivka, which is another very important town, particularly for this section of Ukraine here in the southern Donbass, because as we can see, this is a very critical road right here. Whoops, I don't know why I made it so tiny. Jeez. Well, no, it's gigantic. Just can't win here. Can't win. Anyway, sorry about that. As you can see, we have a road that runs right through here, right down here to Volodar. It's probably not being used. Oops, not 100% on the road, but you get what I mean. This road, quite honestly, probably has been used a ton right now anyway. It is pretty close to the front line and is already cut off in a couple sections. That being said, though, I would imagine that this is probably a pretty important crossroads for Ukraine, because it would allow supplies to go up and down this river. Pretty important logistical hub. And again, if you lose that, you're going to lose that river crossing. Definitely not something you want to lose. That being said, though, this sector has been pretty quiet for a while. There hasn't been a whole ton of movement. So I don't know if the Russians are planning some great counteroffensive here. I could certainly see it coming in the near future. A big move here to take Konstantinivka. We shall see what the future holds for this city. Other than that, though, the fighting remains stagnant in pretty much all other sectors. Not too much movement here in the south. The Russians and Ukrainians have continued to grind up against each other with little movement by either side. Up in the north here, the Russians have been making some half-hearted attempts at attacking into the Kharkiv region. But again, none of these have really yielded any type of success for Russia right now. It seems that the entire focus of the offensive and the entire focus of the Russian army is right here in the central Donbass region. And to me, this makes complete, total sense, given some of the things that we've talked about when it comes to the emerging Russian doctrine in this war. One of the episodes I did months ago, called Is Putin Winning the Long War, is probably one of the episodes of this podcast which is aged the best, because a lot of the issues which I brought up and talked about in that podcast are really coming to the fore right now. And I believe it was that episode where we talked about a lot of how the Russian army's tactics are advancing after their initial defeats. And one of the things that they have been doing is this type of win more strategy, where they will attack in like a general area, and then they will reinforce the areas that are winning and completely abandon the areas which are not. So they usually end up saving their best troops, their shock troops, the best equipment for those win more scenarios. And that's what I feel like and worry might be happening right here, in the central Donbass, as we are seeing one of those win more scenarios where Russia sees that it's making a lot of progress quickly. They might be able to actually make some serious breakthroughs here. And that tells me that we might be seeing some of Russia's best equipment and best soldiers being put into the region shortly. But another thing I talked about in that episode is really how Putin has weathered the storm. And now he has so much so weathered the storm that he is now starting to read the Russian economy to be on not a total war footing. What are they in Hearts of Iron? We're at a partial mobilization right now for the Russian economy. And while it's true that the West is utterly putting Russia to shame in terms of advanced military equipment development, it seems that Russia is putting the West and the EU and NATO to shame in terms of basic armament and bullet production. I'm not going to go into this article yet. This is going to be an article we touch on later on the show, but it's something to remind ourselves that the US has spent so much time fighting insurgents that it has forgot what it actually means to fight a war, a US vet in Ukraine says. We're going to go again into some of the details, but this was something I was thinking about years ago when this war was starting, is that maybe the greatest irony or detriment or whatever you want to say to the United States military would be that all the fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq made it lose all of that kind of institutional memory of what it took to actually fight a real war. Instead of, as this veteran says, their entire military doctrine has now been retooled for anti-insurgency warfare, which is extremely different from conventional warfare. Russia, on the other hand, very much has not lost that capability. Just gonna have some nice footage in the background here for you guys. This is how it's made of an artillery shell. I'll leave the link to the description, I'll leave the link to the video in the description and in the pinned comment if you guys want to check it out. But mainly this is just some background footage as we talk about artillery shells and the amount of artillery shells that Russia is producing is, again, like I mentioned before, putting the West completely to shame. It is estimated that Russia will outproduce not just the United States, but NATO in its entirety about 3-1 when it comes to making artillery shells. One of the things that we have also talked about when we're talking about kind of Russian military history is Russia's emphasis ever since emerging out of the First World War, and particularly in really solidifying this emphasis in World War II. Russia really became a artillery-focused army, had artillery at the heart of virtually all of their military doctrines. And obviously this has moved into the future and stayed with the Russian army moving into the future. And one of the things, a lot of those factories that the Soviet Union used to turn out so many shells and so many bullets, yes, a lot of that capacity has gone away, but it hasn't completely gone away. And they apparently had so much capacity when they were the Soviet Union that it really doesn't seem to have hindered them to have lost the amount that they did. They could still produce shells like there's no tomorrow. It makes me think of, one of my favorites, sorry, I might get off on a little tangent here, but one of my favorite movies of all time is Lord of War. In fact, one of my favorite actors of all time is Nick Cage because of that movie. But if you guys remember the intro to that movie, probably one of the best intros to any movie of all time is The Life of the Bullet, where you see the bullet being made, and it's being made in a factory in Odessa, and you can see how everything is being pushed through, and all the mechanics of how the bullet is being made. It's incredible intro. I just recently watched that intro again because I was thinking about it for this podcast, and it made me think those bullet factories, they haven't gone away, right? A lot of them haven't gone away, and of course that one was in Odessa. And the reason you know this is because it says it on the crates. But anyway, those factories existed all over the Soviet Union, and a lot of them, like I said, didn't go away. Most of them still to this day exist. In fact, a lot of Russia's military production capacity still to this day exists in central Russia beyond the Urals, where Stalin sent them in World War II. Didn't really have any reason to move them anywhere else. So they all just stayed there. And yeah, to this day, that's where they are. But one of the things we are seeing going into this war right now, and why Ukraine is losing a lot of ground right now, and is because of their lack of capacity to make artillery shells in comparison to Russia. You hear all kinds of figures. I've heard figures 3-1, 5-1, as high as 10-1. Obviously, with our fog of war, it's pretty hard to verify exactly what the ratio of Russian to Ukrainian artillery is, but it's pretty safe to say the Russians have a substantial advantage. There was another article, I almost was going to include into this podcast, but I decided not to, but it was an article from another, I believe he might have been British vet, a British sniper in Ukraine, saying that give me artillery shells. I don't need drones. I don't need tanks. I don't need anything else. Give me artillery shells, and this is how we're going to win this war. And it's safe to say, I think, that here in the West, a lot of those basic fundamentals of warfare have fallen by the wayside. We've forgotten the fundamentals, like making bullets, teaching people how to fight in these long-term conventional standing fights like we're seeing in Ukraine. And I mentioned before, I don't know if UK, if Germany, maybe France, actually. France would be the only one I could think would stand a chance because they still use their army separately from the rest of NATO. They have this weird kind of dual doctrine where, yes, their doctrine will conform with NATO doctrine, but they also want to have their own kind of thing to be able to operate independently of them. They have a very fascinating military doctrine and history, but again, we're not going to get too wrapped up in that. Other than that, France, I would see the only country that I could see in Europe and maybe like a country like Poland, who has really been seeing this kind of fight with Russia coming for a long time. It's going to be like France and Poland are the two countries that are going to be best equipped to stand up to Russia right now. But yeah, until the West realizes that the Russians are all in on artillery, they're all in on this doctrine, and until they can somewhat match the Russians in that regard, they're not going to be able to beat them in an attritional warfare like we're fighting right now. And that is, again, one of the biggest things that worries me is that we have really played into, as the West, Russia's hands and devolved this into an attritional warfare, the kind of attritional warfare that Russia excels at. Russia has excelled at throughout its entire history, and we're seeing the Russian colossus wake up and show that it's not 100% dead yet. It's still got a little bit of life left into it. And yeah, but there's another factor that I don't think the West understands this. I think Ukraine and the Ukrainian government is completely aware of this, but Western politicians simply do not understand how all in Putin is on this war, and of course, by extension, Russia, how all in they are in this conflict. As we mentioned before, Russia has done as best it can conceivably can to retool its economy to a war economy. And we're not talking about total war economy, but things that they have done is vastly increase the pay for military contractors, for people who are going to fight in the military, who are going to work in the kind of plants that we're seeing in the background here. The people who are actually going to, like I said, fight or work in the military, they are getting huge pay increases in comparison to the people who do not. And this is a completely contrary state of affairs to what we have in the West, right? In the West, if you are going into the military, it's because it's your passion, right? It's because you're passionate about it. If you want to make money, it almost doesn't matter what kind of military type of profession, whatever you want to say, trade you might have, you're going to make a lot more money using that trade in the private sector in a Western company over the military, unless you happen to work for Lockheed Martin or like one of these high-level military industrial companies. If you're not in that bubble, joining the military is not going to be a way to wealth and success for you in the West. Take something like, if you want to fly, be a pilot, you are going to get paid way more being a commercial airline pilot than staying in, the Air Force type of thing. You're going to get paid more being a cruise ship captain than being a captain in the Navy type of thing. So it's a serious issue in the West, right? Is that how neglected a lot of our military institutions have become. And because they've been so neglected, there's been a serious brain drain, right? A lot of the skilled people aren't moving into the military. They're moving into other positions in the economy. Again, not so happening in Russia. And one of the things, again, we do have to remind ourselves, it's not like the Russian government is throwing a ton of money at soldiers fighting in Ukraine or contractors or people working in the factories. but they are paying them more than the average Russian. And the average pay in Russia is not a lot, so it really doesn't take much to undercut it. And then, before we move into some of the other sections here, one of the things I want to mention is that how Russia has managed to keep up its recruiting in Ukraine and actually managed to keep up its soldiers on the front line. We talked about how they use increased wages in order to bring more people into uniform and put more people on the front lines. Particularly, we're talking people from very rural areas in the middle of Russia where your opportunities are, I'm going to work in the Coke factory, I'm going to plow the farm, or, I'm going to join the military, actually get out of, see another place besides this village, go see other parts of my country, go on adventure, actually get paid more money than I could conceivably get working here. And either way, if I die or if I am successful, I'm going to be a hero to my family back in my village, to my home country, yada, yada, yada. You can see how this can be a very attractive prospect to someone who has spent all their lives in rural Russia. But it's not just from Russia itself that the Kremlin is drawing recruits from. The Kremlin is drawing recruits from anywhere it can. And one of the places that it is drawing recruits from, and that's going to be our time right now to move on to our next segment here, is one country that Russia is pulling recruits from is Nepal. So this was a story I don't believe I brought it up on the podcast. I may have, but I remember seeing this story first appearing years ago in the Eurasian Times. And then before that, I saw it in even more obscure newspaper. So I left it and I didn't really touch it. But now it took a full year and a half for it to actually start to really, this is from December 4th, 2023, before it actually started showing up in some Western news sources. But one thing that the Russians have been doing is going to Nepali recruits and basically saying, hey, you come to Russia, you fight in Ukraine, we're going to give you a Russian passport, you become a Russian citizen, you can move here now, and you're going to have a better shot at having a better life in Russia than you are going to have in Nepal. So let's check out this article here. We're going to go over it very briefly. Again, from December 5th. This is from Reuters. Nepal said it has asked Moscow not to recruit its citizens into the Russian army and immediately send back any Nepali soldier commissioned there back to the Himalayan nation after revealing 6 soldiers serving in Russia's military have been killed. Nepali soldiers, called Gurkhas, and as you guys probably know, the Nepali military and the Gurkhas themselves, one of the most esteemed military traditions in the world. Very well regarded, very well known warriors. It's the reason why the Russians might want them. They are known for their bravery and fighting skills. They've been serving the British and Indian armies following their independence from India in 1974 under an agreement between the 3 countries. The small Himalayan nation, wedged in between China and India, has no such agreement with Russia, which invaded neighboring Ukraine on February 2020 and has been engaged in a war ever since. The Nepali government has said in a statement that 6 of its nationals who have been serving in the Russian army were killed without providing any details. The government of Nepal has requested the Russian government to immediately return their bodies and pay compensation to the families, the foreign minister said late on Monday. Diplomatic efforts were underway to get one Nepali citizen serving in the Russian army and captured by Ukraine released, the statement added. Nepal also urged its citizens not to join the army of the war-torn country. English Daily and the Kathmandu Post quoted Milan Raj Telhidor. Sorry, Raj. I probably did not get that right. Nepal's ambassador to Moscow as saying that 150 to 200 Nepalis were known working as mercenaries in the Russian army. The Russian embassy in Kathmandu did not immediately respond for a request to comment. That being said, though, I would not be and I'll be clear, this is more speculation on my part, but I certainly wouldn't put it past the Russian government to be reaching out to other countries, particularly if they happen to be in their sphere of influence, places like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, even some more neighboring countries. I'm sure they're probably, I would not be shocked if they had some Iranian troops, at least observing the Russians in Ukraine. I certainly don't put it past the Russians to be looking into other countries in their sphere of influence and seeing if they might be able to coax some of their young men into joining the Russian military and fighting in Ukraine. Moving on, this is from a site. This is from a site I hadn't heard of, so I had to do a little bit of vetting. They're called the Defense Post. They are a news organization and conglomerate run by these guys here. They are a news organization that is mainly meant to cater to veterans, professional military contractors, and retired soldiers and that sort of thing. So yeah, I hadn't heard of this, the Defense Post. I hadn't heard of these guys until I ended up checking out this article here. And this is basically a repeat of a Russian article straight from TASS, the Russian news agency. So we have to take things here with a considerable grain of salt. But what we are hearing is that the Russian Ministry of Defense is announcing that the Russian army inducted 1,500 tanks in 2023 to replenish its losses. Just so you guys have a reference, the United States added 135 tanks to its military last year, and this number effectively dwarfs everything that is being produced by not just, again, the United States, but NATO and its allies. Russia is completely crushing the West in terms of tank production. Though we have to remind ourselves that A, this does not cover the amount of tanks lost by Russia in Ukraine. They are still in quite a deficit. B, this almost certainly contains refurbished tanks which are modernized and then sent to the front lines, not necessarily tanks which are built from scratch, right? This is a tank, maybe a T-60, something along those lines, that is taken and refurbished and given new life with maybe some optics, some armor, that kind of crap, and then off she goes. So let's quickly run down this article from the Defense Post. The Russian armed forces have received over 1,500 main battle tanks in 2023, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense. It has increased its tank sufficiency level to over 84%, TASS reported, citing the Ministry of Defense end-of-year's papers. Other platforms, okay, so rather this is directly from the Ministry of Defense, so even bigger grain of salt. Other platforms inducted over the period include over 22,000 drones and over 2,200 armored combat vehicles, with over 1,400 rocket launchers and artillery vehicles. Mothballed tanks, it's not clear how many of the inducted tanks are new and how many of them are older models. Russia has reportedly pulled off thousands of mothballed tanks from storage during the invasion. It has also reportedly ordered the modernization of about 800 T-62s, which were first inducted in the 1960s. Russian tank losses since Moscow invaded Ukraine, with an estimated fleet of 3,417 main battle tanks, around 3.5 times that of Ukraine. Russia has lost roughly 60% of those 2,000 by mid-2023, the Moscow Times reported in July, citing the Kiel Institute, Ukraine's support tracker. Moscow apparently lost 15%, 2,475 of its entire tank fleet during the invasion, according to the UK Ministry of Defense Intelligence update in November. Overall losses include 7,100 armored vehicles, 1,300 artillery systems, 93 fixed-wing aircraft, 132 helicopters, and 320 drones during the period. Ukraine's estimate of the latest Russian tank losses in the war are close to 6,000. The overall losses include 11,107 armored vehicles, 8,546 artillery pieces, and over 600 fixed and rotary wing manned aircraft, and about 361,500 personnel. It also includes nearly 7,000 unmanned aerial systems, according to the Ukrainian military estimate. I gotta say, that is a massive number. I definitely see that as being an overestimate on Ukraine's end. Just to be clear, the Russians are adding a lot of tanks, but we again don't know how much of these are, again, modern systems or refurbished systems. That being said, though, there's currently nobody in the world that is popping out tanks to the extent that Russia is right now. And honestly, it's not even close. So we can't spend any time talking about Russian tanks without talking about Russia's latest military innovation, the Russian Turtle tank, which, as you can see, is a tank effectively completely encased in metal armor. And as ridiculous as this thing looks, it would actually be a major step up in stopping attacks from above, which is what the proverbial cope cage was designed to do initially. This is basically a further manifestation of the cope cage, the ultimate manifestation of the cope cage, if you will, and it will certainly be more effective in that regard, though not completely effective. The one thing, though, that I see very few, only a handful of people have brought this up, and this to me pops out immediately, is it's not just about the defense of the top, it is about the defense of the treads. Let us just pull out ye old coloring stick, and I can show you guys. As you can see, the armor goes all the way down and covers the treads of the vehicle. And what we talked about when we talked about the advances in Russian military tactics, when we went over that big document, one of the things that we read was that the number one way vehicles are eliminated in Ukraine is by taking out the treads, because as soon as you take out the treads, you're immobile, you're a sitting duck for the next artillery shell that's going to come in and blow you up. So anytime the treads become immobile, Russian, Ukrainian, doesn't matter. The crew is pretty much, they're dipping immediately, because if they stay, they're dead. And of course, the most vulnerable part of a tank is always going to be the treads. The treads, I'm not a super nerd when it comes to tank development and history, more when it comes to the development and history of firearms. But one thing I can definitely notice when it comes to tank development and history, one of the number one issues for tank designers is those treads, and designing a way to make those treads flexible enough to be that kind of continuous caterpillar tread, but also durable enough that they don't get blown apart immediately, because that can be a pretty finicky system that you're building out. So defending your treads is a serious deal when it comes to defending your tank. And you can see it right here, is that what is one of their top priorities is defending those treads. The big thing, though, that this screams to me is like, how the hell is the commander going to see anything? The commander of the tank can't see shit. He is forced to be able to view the exact same vision that the driver is. I myself, not a tanker, but I got lots of buddies who were in the military and were tankers. And I remember I always naively thought that like the driver was like the top guy, the top position. Nah, the driver is like the lowest position. The driver is like the bitch. And obviously the commander is the top guy, and the commander has the ability to be able to see everything around him. And when it comes to your tank driver, you just want them to do exactly what the commander does without any hesitation, without any thought, just be a complete and total input machine for the commander. Anyway, my point is he's going to be able to do that a lot less effectively if he can't see what the hell is going on. One of the things I've read that they might be doing with this setup is they might be having like a UAV, a drone following them around to be able to see what's going on around the tank. Certainly plausible, though I'd imagine, right, you can't always do that in every circumstance. And even then, I can imagine that trying to see what you're seeing on the screen with the drone, trying to command the drone at the same time, and then interpret what you're seeing on the screen to your driver and keep everything still going on would be a very difficult task for a tank commander. So this is just another example of the Russian army trying to improvise and innovate over a lot of its issues. And one thing, again, that Russian military history has shown time and time again is that the Russians are masters of improvisation. And not only that, the Ukrainians are doing this too, because they are forced to, because now they're not getting the same equipment deliveries that they used to be. So now they are the ones who are forcing themselves to cannibalize their own weapons, break them apart and rebuild them, because they need to replace what they have with whatever they can get their hands on. So we're going to wrap this episode up before we get to that last article. There is something I want to show you guys here. As you guys probably know, VE Day is coming up very quickly, which is Victory in Europe Day, the defeat of Nazi Germany. And this is a very big deal in Russia. And as part of their celebration upcoming for VE Day, what they are doing is they are showcasing destroyed Western weapons that they got in Ukraine. And to me, this is just so wild. This is like a total medieval kind of play, exactly the kind of thing I could see Russia doing too. And it's going to completely reinforce all of their propaganda narratives for their own people. Because one of the big propaganda narratives in this war that the Kremlin is telling to the Russian people is that this is you against the world. The West is coming in and they're coming in to try and mess you guys up. I believe that over the German tanks, one of the banners they have says something along the lines of history is repeating itself. So you can see that they are certainly playing into this very, very thickly. You guys can read that. I'll try and move a little bit over here so you can read it in its entirety while he's talking. But yeah, I'm assuming that this is definitely going to completely reinforce a lot of those narratives. And I am sure that the people going to see them are going to be stoked. Here, I'll tell you one thing. If, I don't know what you're talking about, lady. I can have her stare at us for a little bit. Maybe she'll stare into our souls. But anyway, okay, now she's distracting me. Let's look at the tank again. Oh yeah, all I was going to say is that if the United States did something like that, I would be all over it. If they displayed a bunch of captured Russian military tanks and other equipment, I would be there. I would love to see some shit like that. I'm a nerd for military technology. So we're going to end on this article here that I mentioned before. There was something, man, that really bothered me because I feel like the way that a lot of outlets here in our Western democracies are not doing the best to frame this war and what is happening and are setting up people to be confused. I remember this was maybe a year ago, I read something like top UK military intelligence analyst says that it's going to take 20 years for Russia to retrain all of its troops. And I'm thinking, you guys not understand how military training works? The best kind of military training you could have is literally fighting a war. So if anything, Russian troops and Ukrainian troops are probably the two most well-trained armies in the world right now because they're the ones actually fighting the conventional war. Nothing is going to train your army better than fighting a war. There's no amount of virtual training or war gaming or what have you that will ever get your army ready for the actual experience of combat than what fighting actual combat will do. It's obvious that the Russians, especially given their military strategy throughout their history, their tactic is to grind it out. They are going to grind it out until they find something that works for them. And then when they do, they are going to push that advantage mercilessly until they win. So all of these losses, initially, Russia almost views that as the training process. Losing these troops teaches us what not to do so we can readjust the way we do things in the future. I don't know, just like I said, a lot of the way that the Russian military is framed in our country or countries frustrates me. Anyway, let us go over this article here. Our top bullet points here: an American veteran who fought in Ukraine says that the U.S. kind of forgot what it means to actually fight a war. He said U.S. training has long been heavily focused on fighting insurgents in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. He said that his own training wouldn't have prepared him for war like Ukraine. And that is the line I want to focus in right there. The guy saying that the training he got from the U.S. Army would not at all prepare him for what a conventional war is like. It's like they have to completely throw out the book to teach people what it's like to fight a real war. An American veteran who fought in Ukraine said the U.S. military has spent so long focused on fighting insurgents that it forgot what it means to fight and win an actual war. We have long neglected a lot of training on how to fight and survive in a peer-on-peer adversary war, the veteran, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, told Business Insider. He said that in the U.S. military, we mostly have been focusing on guerrilla war, battling insurgents with places like Iraq and Afghanistan in mind. The U.S. military invested decades and billions of dollars and thousands of lives in the fights in those places. The former soldier spoke about how his training with the U.S. military a number of years ago compared to what he saw in Ukraine, where he started fighting when Russia's full-scale invasion began in February of 2022. He fought in Iraq as a contractor after leaving the U.S. military, and in Ukraine. He fought in hotspots like Kharkiv and served as his unit's combat medic, treating comrades when they were injured in the fight. We've gotten so used to the idea of just fighting guerrilla wars and fucking fighting terrorists. I can't believe they left that in there. That's awesome. And fucking fighting terrorists and everything else that we forgot what it means to fight an actual war, he said. The conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan were real wars that came at a severe human cost in lives. But the war in Ukraine is an industrial war, which leaves levels of destruction like the world has not seen in a long time. With the focus on wars in the Middle East during this century, the US and some of its NATO allies in Europe have allowed the skills needed for this kind of conflict to atrophy. The veteran says that when he went through training, he never got any real training for a peer-on-peer conflict. A little bit of talking, and that's about it, and just a little bit of training. But nothing to the point that would have prepared me for the war in Ukraine, he recalled. He said that he has seen a lot of Western soldiers struggle in Ukraine, as they already have a set idea of how things should be and everything, and that's just not the way it is out in Ukraine. He said that U.S. soldiers are used to fighting at an equipment and manpower advantage, but against Russia and Ukraine, a lot of the time, I fought at a disadvantage in comparison to the enemy. That is wild. They don't teach American soldiers what it's like to actually have to grind it out and fight when you're surrounded, or when the odds are against you, or when you might not have the support you need, or you might not have the access to the best equipment. He's saying that in situations where the U.S. doesn't have access to all of that, in situations where American soldiers need to improvise, they might really struggle. And I think that this is one of the reasons why I really wanted to end this episode with this article. I think that this is a huge wake-up call for the West, what is happening in Russia. And I'm not going to speculate. Maybe, okay, fuck it. I am a speculator. Of course I'm going to speculate. What the hell am I saying? Of course I'm going to speculate. I very firmly believe that Putin is gearing up for some kind of major confrontation with the West, some sort of major confrontation with NATO, particularly if things go well for him in Ukraine and he ends up coming out as the winner, then he's going to be emboldened even more for some sort of future conflict with NATO, some sort of future conflict with the West. So I certainly think it's more than possible that we could be fighting against Russia in the future. And if, God forbid, we lose in Ukraine, it needs to be a massive wake-up call for the West that they need to shake up and retool their military-industrial complex, their military tactics, their military training and doctrines in a huge fundamental way. All right, guys, let's wrap this up here. In the U.S. military, he explained, I believe a lot of training that we have is tailored towards fighting in a guerrilla warfare nowadays than it is to actually fighting a peer-to-peer adversary like it would be with Russia or China. He said, this is an issue that many NATO members face. Another American veteran in Ukraine told Business Insider this month that he had similar concerns. He said that he has friends that are still in the U.S. Army which ask him for tips on how to fight wars with drones or in trenches, that they aren't getting that training fully reflects what is happening in Ukraine. Wow, that's incredible that his buddies are asking him to fill in the gaps that they are not getting in training. Questions about Western training. Multiple NATO countries have trained Ukrainian soldiers, but the veteran said that some of the Ukrainians he fights with described some of that training as irrelevant or inadequate. Oh man, that's devastating. The veteran soldiers said that the Ukrainian soldiers who were trained in the UK told him when they were asked how they got through Russia's vast minefields, they were told just to go around them. Wow. But the problem is that Ukraine says that some of Russian minefields stretch for miles and miles. Well, obviously, that's okay. Making such a strategy all but impossible. Furthermore, open areas that are not mined may already be targeted by artillery or other battlefield threats. He described that some of the training that Ukrainians have gotten as making sense on paper, but it just doesn't work in Ukraine because it's not the same type of warfare. A Russian invasion of Ukraine has repeatedly led to a lot of questions about Western training. Some Ukrainian soldiers have trained abroad and said that the training they received was not suited for the kind of fighting needed in this war. a Ukrainian commander who was trained by US, British, and Polish soldiers, said that last year, if he had followed these countries' advice exactly, he would likely have been killed. Jesus Christ. Many Ukrainians have used NATO training and tactics when Ukraine launched its counteroffensive last summer, but some of the approaches, such as an overemphasis on maneuver warfare without air support in the face of dense minefields and other daunting barriers, ultimately failed. The Ukrainians have since changed their tactics after experiencing serious losses in a switch that is praised by some war analysts, but it wasn't enough. Another U.S. Army veteran who has been fighting and training soldiers in Ukraine told Business Insider last year that Ukraine's forces would have been worse off if they had followed the U.S. battlefield doctrine. He said that the Ukrainians are actually better at understanding some of the aspects of modern fighting than the U.S. Holy crap! And though they have also made costly mistakes at times in their execution, but such can be the nature in any war. A different type of war. The veteran said that a lot of foreign fighters have come to Ukraine expecting to have the same advantages they have had in previous conflicts, and that many have been killed as a result of having the wrong mindset. Other U.S. veterans who have fought in Ukraine said they found the fighting to be far worse than in Afghanistan and Iraq, describing Ukraine as being at a disadvantage that the U.S. never was, recalling the ceaseless attacks by Russia. One previously told Business Insider that the relentless fighting in Ukraine often means that unlike in Iraq and Afghanistan, there is no break and no chance to relax. It's that kind of fighting that takes a severe toll, both mentally and physically, on a soldier. He said that there are many places where he fought in Ukraine that there is nowhere to be safe. While in Iraq and Afghanistan, if you were a mile behind the front line, you could stand outside and have a barbecue and have a sandwich and a drink. Ukraine is fighting in conditions that are very different from what the US and NATO and its allies have had to fight through in recent decades. And while there is a renewed interest in readying for a near peer-to-peer or even peer-level fight against an adversary such as Russia or China, rebuilding the skills for a great power conflict isn't something that happens overnight. Again, which is why we needed to start doing it yesterday. Lessons from the Cold War and World Wars have to be relearned, with some new modern developments that demand new ways of learning war from scratch. The war has often devolved into a grinding fight that features trench warfare and both sides relying on decades-old equipment. Many soldiers have described the war in Ukraine as resembling World War I and World War II more than any modern conflict, though there are also modern elements like drones and missiles. It's a comparison that the veteran made too. He said that fighting to clear Russian trenches made him feel like he was fighting in World War I. The overwhelming role of artillery speaks to that as well. Ukraine has largely been praised for its ability to fight against Russia, which has a much larger military, and many experts say that Ukraine has a lot it can teach the West about fighting Russia. Yes, absolutely it can. The veteran said, "I believe that the Ukrainians could teach some things to the Western militaries, to NATO, just because we haven't fought a conventional war in fucking forever." There you go. Perfect way to end this article and my thoughts exactly. Yeah, not to end on such a bleak note, but again, hopefully now military commanders and politicians on the West are starting to have those alarms raised in their head a little bit and actually think that it's time to retool our military to what it would be like fighting a peer or near peer adversary, but we will see what actually happens. Not feeling the most hopeful these days. Anyway, with that, unfortunately, I'm going to have to wrap up this episode. Starting to get a little bit of a sore throat. Anyway, going to have to wrap it up here regardless. With that, I want to thank you guys for watching. This has been the Comrade, signing off for now. And until next time, you guys take care.